Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I want to tell you about 12 wonderful Victorian novels that you probably haven't read. So the other day I finished reading this amazing book, A Life for a Life by Dinah Mulock-Craig, which was just fantastic, like absolute top-notch Victorian literature. My favourite Victorian novel I've read for several years. This was incredible, and I kind of wanted to make a whole video just talking about A Life for a Life, but it's quite a sort of twisty-turny, slow burn novel, and I feel like I can't really make a spoiler-free review of it. There's just so much I can't say. So I was thinking it would be nice to make a video talking about this and some other books, and then coincidentally, like the same day, someone messaged me on Instagram asking if I had a video talking about my favourite forgotten or obscure Victorian novels. And while I do have various videos talking about obscure and forgotten or underrated Victorian novels, several of them are like quite old, or they're like more specific. I don't think I've done a video just on my like favourite underrated Victorian books, so I thought, why not do that today? So I have 12 books to talk to you about today, one of which is A Life for a Life. All of these books are sort of pretty underrated, pretty unknown. I think looking at their like reviews on Goodreads, I think one of them has like 900 reviews, but the vast majority of them have under 500, if not under 50, if not like 20. A couple of them are by authors who have other books that are better known, but some of these are just by authors who have not really lasted in the popular imagination, even though they wrote some fantastic things. I have limited myself to one book per author, though there are some authors here that I love and that I've read a lot from and that have a lot of underrated works, but I thought that would help me narrow down and make this video a little bit more manageable. I think the majority of these books are by female Victorian authors, partly because it does tend to be the female authors whose books fall out of favour over time and are less likely to remain kind of in the canon. Anyway, let me get into the book. So I'm going to start off by talking about A Life for a Life, because that was the book that kind of inspired this video, and then I'll go through the rest in alphabetical order. I'm not going to rank these. Yes, A Life for a Life. Oh, this was amazing. So good, so good. Like genuinely just my favourite Victorian book I've read for years. Probably. I have read some really amazing books by Anthony Trollope over the last couple of years, but if you take Anthony Trollope out of the equation, this is the best Victorian book I've read for several years. So I've read multiple books by Dinah Craig before. I think she's a fantastic Victorian author, very underrated, very, very talented. My favourite book of hers previously has always been Olive, which is a fantastic buildings romance that I often recommend as like an alternative to Jane Eyre, and that looks at disability in a really interesting way. But I think I might love A Life for a Life even more than Olive. And yeah, this was just absolutely magnificent, so compelling, so readable, so tense, so beautiful and emotional, and just wonderful. So this is a dual narrative told from two perspectives. Every chapter is labelled her story or his story, and we are following these two people. A young woman called Dora, who is in her mid-20s. She's sort of bored and dissatisfied with life. She is the plain one of the family. Everyone thinks she's a bit dull. She sort of has a bit of a Mary Bennet quality, perhaps, or at least that is sort of the role she has within the family. And she is not very happy in life, and she goes to this ball at the beginning of the book, and she's not dancing because no one ever asks her to dance. And at this ball she has a conversation with a military doctor who is stationed in the barracks nearby, and then the next chapter is from his perspective, and we begin to learn more about this doctor Max and the long shadow that has been thrown over his life by an incident in his youth, and this secret that he carries. And what follows is a slow burn mystery and a slow burn love story, and it's just exquisitely paced and so wonderfully written. I was so emotionally invested. Like, I think this is one of my favourite love stories in Victorian literature. Do I love the love story in this more than North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell? Maybe not quite, but like, it's up there. It was incredible. But also the mystery elements of the book were so well done, and there were sort of several, not exactly twists, but you know, there are several reveals in the book, and both of them are led up to in such a way that it slowly dawns on you what the truth is before you get to the reveal point, but in a very slow, like, just perfect way. It was just amazing, and the writing was so great, and I was so invested, and I just loved this so much. I thought it was so good. I read it in less than a week, and you know, it's not a tiny book, and Victorian literature does tend to take me a little bit longer to get through, but I just raced through it, absolutely loving every second of it, and I thought it was incredible. And yeah, Dinah Craik was just a genius. So yes, I highly recommend A Life for a Life. This is the first book I read in April, and this is definitively my favourite book of 2026 so far. It was amazing. Okay, right, on to some other wonderful underrated Victorian books. The next novel I want to mention is Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. Bulwer-Lytton is one of those authors where I feel like his name still has some recognition, but I feel like hardly anyone has read anything by him. And I read Night and Morning by him a couple of years ago and really enjoyed it. It's a really interesting coming of age story, sort of combined with a bit of a revenge tale. It's quite Dickensian in many ways, but there were also certain aspects of it that made me think of the Count of Monte Cristo. It follows the life of a young boy, later young man, whose parents were married very privately and very secretly, and the paperwork was lost, meaning that after his father's death, no one believes that he's really the legitimate heir to his father's fortune, and he ends up trying to struggle to support his family while also sort of really resenting the cousin who has ended up taking the property that could have been his. And it's a really interesting, pacey buildings romance with some really great plot elements and some really interesting social criticism, and I just really enjoyed it. It's not a book I hear many people talk about. As I said, I don't generally hear many people reading Bulwer-Lytton, but I thought Night and Morning was really fantastic, and if you like a buildings romance, it's well worth your time. The next book I want to mention is Jill by Amy Dillwyn, and if you have been watching my channel for a while, you may have heard me talk about Jill before, because it is a very underrated Victorian book that not many people have read, but I do talk about it all the time because I think it's wonderful, and I know that I have encouraged some of you to read it as well. But Jill is just a really wild romp of a Victorian novel. It is about a young woman called Jill. She's an upper class lady, but she's bored of her life, so she runs away from home, becomes a maidservant, and goes on all kinds of adventures. And Jill is just everything that a Victorian woman was not meant to be. She is a liar. She has no interest in morals. She's much more interested in money than in marriage. She's attracted to other women, and that's not even like just undertones in this book. It is very clearly the case in this novel. Jill just breaks down all of the gender norms of the Victorian period in a glorious way, and it's also just a fun romp of a novel in which Jill gets to go on the kind of adventures that usually only men get to have in Victorian literature, and I just love Jill a lot. It is a wild ride of a book, and really excellent fun. I have read several other books by Amy Dillwyn. She's an author I really like. I would also highly recommend the Rebecca writer Anna Burglary, and I definitely want to read more by her in the future because I've loved everything by her so far, but Jill remains my favourite. It's just such a fun read and does such clever things with gender and undermining Victorian ideas about gender, and I really like it a lot, so I highly recommend Jill as well. The next book I want to recommend is Gloriana, or The Revolution of 1900 by Florence Dixie. This is a novel from the 1890s about a feminist revolution happening in 1900, and it is both a really interesting novel in terms of gender and proto-feminism and all of the radical thought within it, but it's also got the plot of a sensation novel with lots of backstabbing and betrayal and secret reveals, and it's very pacey and very fun. I feel like it would have been very easy for Gloriana to be a bit of a manifesto in a book. You know, if I compare it to something like News from Nowhere by William Morris, which is about a sort of socialist utopia, News from Nowhere sort of has no plot and is mostly just look at this possible other world, whereas Gloriana has an incredible plot that is really fun and fast-paced and dramatic, while also dealing with a lot of really radical social thought and a lot of really interesting discussion of gender. And I just love Gloriana. It's one of those books that I read a few years ago, but I just think about all the time, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you're interested in sort of the history of feminism and proto-feminism and women's rights. I love Gloriana, or The Revolution of 1900, very much indeed. The next book on my list is My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon, which is a really fun novel told in the form of vignettes, where basically every chapter is just a woman recounting her various flirtations with all the various men that she has encountered in her time out in society. It's very lighthearted and funny and anecdotal, but there are also sort of elements running through it of social criticism and discussion of sort of women's place within society in the Victorian period. It sort of vaguely falls into the sort of new woman fiction category that a book like Gloriana would, less because the main character in My Flirtations is sort of part of the new woman movement, but because her sister is very much part of the new woman movement and is always just like in the background of all the scenes, just rolling her eyes at the narrator's flirtations, which I think is quite nicely done. And in general, I just really enjoyed My Flirtations. It's a very quick read and a really fun one. And I think if you're looking for sort of a fun Victorian read, or if you're, you know, sometimes put off by Victorian novels that seem a bit heavier or a bit longer, then My Flirtations is a really fun one to read. And just, yeah, a really, really enjoyable novel. Talking of new women fiction, I also wanted to mention The Beth Book by Sarah Grand. This is an incredible late Victorian buildings roman that I think is probably one of the best buildings romans I've ever read, and one of the best sort of character studies. It's a book that really looks at the like psychological development of a child into adulthood. It's about someone called Beth, and we follow her from, I think, just before her birth into her 20s, and we look at her through every stage of her life. We look at her development as a person, we look at the development of her mind, as well as the society that she lives in and the way she interacts with that society, and the various sort of difficulties that women were likely to encounter in the late Victorian period. And it's just a really incredible coming of age story, while also dealing with some really interesting proto-feminist themes, and looking at the complexities of marriage as an institution within the Victorian period. I just love The Beth Book so much. It's a novel that I think about all the time and that has really, really stayed with me since I read it back in, I guess, 2023. It's not very well known. I don't hear people talk about it that often, but I think it is truly amazing and really, really worth your time, especially if you like a coming of age story or if you're interested in proto-feminist literature, then The Beth Book is an absolute must read. The next underrated Victorian novel I wanted to recommend is The Half Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. This is another one like Jill that if you've watched my channel for some years, you may have heard me talk about before, because this is a book I love very, very much and do mention often. This is just a wonderful Victorian novel that looks at the lives of two half-sisters. They don't initially know of each other's existence. One is the legitimate daughter of her father and the other is the illegitimate daughter of her father. So the legitimate daughter, Alice, has had a very middle-class upbringing, and her life initially follows the expected path for a middle-class lady in the Victorian period. Meanwhile, her illegitimate half-sister, Bianca, has had a very different, much more impoverished upbringing, and she ends up becoming an actress and having a career and leading a very different life, and very much not what Victorian society considered the ideal life for a woman. And the book kind of looks at the contrast between these two sisters, what happens when they do meet each other, and the various characters around them. And I just think it's a really, really interesting novel. I think that this book, sort of like The Beth Book and Gloriana, looks really interestingly at gender politics within the Victorian period and has some really interesting proto-feminist elements. This is from a lot earlier in the century than those two books, which are from the 1890s. This is from the 1840s, I believe. But it is really interesting in terms of its look at gender and class within the Victorian period, as well as just being a wonderful story. So I highly, highly recommend The Half Sisters. It's really worth your time. The next book I want to talk about is Wylder's Hand by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Now, Le Fanu, some of his works have remained very popular. His vampire novella, Camilla, remains very widely read. And I would say his novel, Uncle Silas, is like mediumly known. But I don't hear many people talk about Wylder's Hand. And I thought this was a really fascinating novel, a really interesting, pacey, sensation novel that I found fascinating, and also has like quite an interesting narrative voice or like narrative style. So Wylder's Hand follows the sort of rivalry between these two warring families in a neighborhood, and they are about to sort of call a truce on their long-term feud by the marriage of two people within them when Mr. Wylder vanishes. Where has he gone? Has he left because he doesn't want to go on with the marriage? Has something happened to him? What is going on with Wylder? We follow various characters and how his disappearance affects them. And we know that many of them are sort of keeping secrets. And it's told in first person, but by a character who is like often absent. And then he'll be like, oh, but I know about this because someone told me. So there's always sort of like a layer of narrative unreliability, which I quite enjoy. And I also love the title. It's a very clever title with like at least 3 meanings. I don't feel like I can say more than that without spoilers, but I feel like because of its dual meanings and the way they become clear over the course of the book, it therefore is like one of my absolute favourite titles to a Victorian novel. I just really enjoyed this one, and if you like Victorian sensation novels, then I would highly recommend it. The next book I want to mention is The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy. This is another old favourite of mine, and according to Goodreads is the most popular and well-known and well-read of these books, but I still feel like it's pretty obscure, so I thought I would talk about it today. The Romance of the Shop is a short Victorian novel about a group of sisters who set up a photography shop together, and the book looks at their efforts to earn a living from photography as well as their romantic relationships. I found this really interesting in terms of the history of photography and the history of sort of women's role within the workplace and what work was and wasn't considered acceptable for women, but I also find it really, really interesting in terms of the very different sisters and their different sort of wants in life and their different expectations from life. In general, I just think this is a really interesting read. It's also very short and won't take you long at all. The next book I wanted to mention is Drama in Muslin by George Moore. I read this quite a long time ago now, and I feel like I haven't spoken about it much lately, but it is a really, really interesting novel and one that I do think about from time to time. George Moore was an Irish Victorian writer, and this book is set in Dublin and follows high society in Dublin and the lives of various women. It is a really interesting book for lots of reasons. One, because I think it gives you a really good insight into like Dublin society and sort of high society in Dublin, and often like Victorian books I read even by Irish writers are often set in England, or Victorian books that I read set in Ireland are often set in rural places, and the insight into Dublin society in Drama in Muslin is really interesting. There's also quite a lot about the Landleaguers in here and sort of rising tensions in Ireland at this point in time, and it's also quite a scandalous book. It was received sort of complicatedly at the time because of this. There is a young lady having an affair outside of marriage, and there is a young lady who is definitely in love with her female friend, and it's just one of those Victorian novels that is like pushing all the boundaries in a really interesting way. So I really like this one and would highly recommend it. And yes, this has reminded me that I should read more by George Moore because I read a few books by him a few years ago, and I haven't read anything by him for ages, and I really should. The penultimate book on my list is A Struggle for Fame by Charlotte Riddell. Charlotte Riddell, like George Moore, is an Irish writer, and this book follows two Irish writers who have moved to London to try and make their way in the world of writing. There is a young man and a young woman, and the book looks at their struggles for fame and their struggles to make a living from their writing. And it's just a really, really interesting like a dissection of the Victorian publishing industry and what it's like to be a writer. Also the sort of like gender power dynamics within writing and the difficulties that our main female writer has because of her gender and sort of the different expectations of her, and all of that stuff is really, really interesting. But it's also just a really engaging, accessible Victorian book. Charlotte Riddell is a really interesting Victorian writer. I definitely want to read more by her because this is the only thing I've read so far, and I absolutely loved it when I read it a few years ago, so I highly, highly recommend this one. And the final book on my list of 12 underrated Victorian novels is Linda Tressel by Anthony Trollope. Now, Anthony Trollope, I would say, is the best known author on this list, and some of his books are very famous and still in print and continually in print and do very well and have a lot of readers. But he wrote 47 novels, which, you know, is a lot, and some of his novels have been very, very forgotten. And Linda Tressel is one of the books of his that has been quite forgotten and that I think is really, really fantastic. And also that I think has very broad appeal. I love Anthony Trollope and I love his books so much and get so much out of them. But I can see that there will be certain things that might frustrate people or ways in which his books wouldn't be for everyone. Whereas I just feel like Linda Tressel, even if you haven't got on with other Anthony Trollope books, like Linda Tressel is just a fantastic novel that I feel like everyone should read and everyone would get something out of. Interestingly, it was one of the two books that Anthony Trollope published anonymously originally, and I do feel like it's quite different from his other books. And it's not one that I have spoken about very much, but I do think it's a really, really strong book and a really powerful one. It does not have the same Anthony Trollope coziness that you get in some of his books. It is not a cozy novel, but it is very good. So Linda Tressel is set in Germany and is about a young woman called Linda Tressel. She lives with her aunt and their lodger. And the house they live in is technically Linda's, but because she's a young woman, her aunt has always considered the house theirs. And early on in the novel, their lodger, who is a good sort of 20, 30 years older than Linda, expresses interest in marrying Linda because he wants to own the house and to get property. And Linda's aunt thinks this would be a great idea. And so Linda's aunt and the lodger begin to slowly pressure Linda into marrying the lodger, who she does not want to marry, who she does not like, who she does not trust. She's in love with someone else. And even if she wasn't, she really cannot stand this man. And what follows is just the sort of slow attempt to wear away Linda's resolve. And it is horrible. Like, it's not a pleasant book, but it's so fantastically written. And I think it's a really, really powerful Victorian novel in terms of looking at the position of women and power dynamics and issues of consent, really, because so much of this book is about trying to make Linda marry this man that she does not want to marry, despite the fact that it's very clear that she does not want to marry him. Her consent to this marriage is sort of, you know, considered not important. It is a quite like distressing book in many ways, but it's so fantastically written, and it's one of those Anthony Trollope books that I just think about all the time and that's really, really stayed with me. Like, I think when I first read it, I rated it like 4 stars, but on reflection I think it's actually one of his best novels. Like, on reflection I would up it to 5 stars, and I think it's one of his masterpieces because I think it is just a really powerful condensed oppressive novel that is not, fun and cozy as some of Trollope's books are, but is a real, like, a really fantastic novel. So I highly, highly recommend Linda Tressel. Not an Anthony Trollope book I hear people talk about very much, but I do think it's amazing. So there we go. Those are 12 incredible Victorian novels that you probably haven't read. You may have read some of them, especially if you've been watching this channel for a while, because I do talk about some of these books often. But I think it's unlikely that many of you have read all of them, and I would highly recommend them. They're all fantastic. I would like to especially recommend A Life for a Life, because I only finished it a few days ago and it was so good, and I'm just still like thinking about how incredible it was. And I think it's wonderful, and I think more people should read it because it's not a well-known book at all, but it was so good. And yeah, amazing, amazing stuff. Do let me know down in the comments if you have any recommendation for your favourite underrated Victorian books. And otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.